Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ancient History Jewelry Stories. Last month's episodes were devoted to a challenging and truly deep dive into the history of jewelry as magical symbol, where we didn't even get to cover anything more recent than pre-Columbian cultures in the Americas. We'll eventually get back to that topic in a future month's deep dive, but for now, I wanted to move on to something that wasn't so dense and, dare I say, a little bit more entertaining. August's deep dive videos and podcast episodes will be all about some of the greatest scandals in jewelry history, everything from mysteries and heists to elaborate royal schemes. I think most of you know what this podcast is all about, but if you're new here, hello! Ancient History Jewelry Stories is a podcast and video series where we examine history through the lens of jewelry. I'm your host and resident ancient jewelry fanatic, Melise, and I'm a goldsmith trained in ancient techniques. Along with this podcast, I make videos that can be found on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube under the username moonhoney.jewelry. Next month's deep dive topic is going to be determined by a poll on Patreon. So if you would like to have a say in what we discuss in September's podcasts and Deep Dive Wednesday videos, head over to patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories and join the $5 a month tier. That is currently the only way to have a say in future video topics. Now, on to the good stuff. Like all things relating to gold and jewelry, we can trace stories of jewelry theft back to the ancient world. The queen's tombs at the royal palace of Nimrud in ancient Mesopotamia house a sarcophagus that bears a curse, specifically calling out anyone who would steal the deceased queen's jewelry. Ancient Egypt is rife with stories of theft, with tombs being built with increasingly clever, but ultimately useless, safeguards to try to keep tomb robbers out. During times of economic depression and political distress, there were even periods of what can be called state-sanctioned looting in Egypt. The same priests who filled and closed the tombs would come back to empty them out. After all, they knew how to get in. The only reason the treasures found in Tutankhamun's tomb were, found, was because the entrance to the tomb had been obscured by debris from the building of a much larger royal tomb not too long after Tut's death. About 2 centuries after his short life, the construction of the shared tomb of Ramses V and Ramses VI completely covered the entrance of Tutankhamun's tomb with piles of stone shards and sand, leaving it hidden for over 3,000 years. There were actually 2 break-ins immediately after the tomb was sealed in antiquity, but it seems that very little was taken. Priests re-entered the tomb and tidied up a bit before resealing it, but if you look at photos of the tomb before everything was removed, you can see the haphazard way objects and offerings were set back after being tossed around by tomb robbers. Chances are, whatever was taken during those 2 robberies was jewelry. But that's not a scandal so much as a fact of the ancient world. Tombs have been in danger of being looted in all cultures that have ever buried objects of value with the dead. They are still being looted today, and the issue of artifacts stolen from ancient sites being sold on the black market has been a significant issue since at least the 19th century. I could wax poetic about why jewelry is so alluring to humans, why it presses that greed button, why there are so many stories, fact and fiction, about people going to great lengths to pilfer jewels that don't belong to them, but I think that's self-explanatory. We all know it. Jewelry is just so very stealable. It lights up the pleasure centers of our brains and makes us want to reach out a hand to grab like a baby. Not to mention the tremendous value jewelry can have, with both precious metals and rare gems fetching absurd prices for no reason other than we think they are very, very pretty. We are simple creatures, and something aesthetically pleasing, which glints and glimmers in the light, just makes us happy. So many movies have centered around a jewel heist, from drama to caper to rom-com. It's a common trope. A group of criminals, or maybe one criminal, but he's the best criminal in the world, have to outsmart an ultra-secure auction house / museum / bank to steal something very glittery and very valuable. Of course, that begs the question, Who do you turn around and sell the world-famous 100-carat diamond to? What pawnshop is willing to take the royal jewels off your hands? What is the resale value of a priceless Ceylon sapphire anyway? Trying to fence a well-known and highly guarded gem or jewel is a topic that deserves its own genre of movies, and, as we will see, it's the downfall of a few of these jewelry scandals. Let's start with a good old-fashioned crown jewels scandal. We are going back to 1671, to an old-timey heist that's equal parts genius and stupid. The perpetrator here is a man named Thomas Blood, who, in 1671, would have been 52 or 53 years old. He had an elaborate, painstaking plan to steal the royal jewels, involving the best kind of intrigue 17th century England had to offer: social intrigue. At this time, you could pay a small fee to view the royal jewels at the Tower of London. Blood, disguised as a parson and accompanied by a woman pretending to be his wife, paid his coins to the custodian of the jewels, a man of the impressive age of 77 in 17th century London, named Talbot Edwards. He was new to the job. While viewing the jewels, Blood's quote-unquote wife feigned sudden stomach pains and asked Edwards to fetch her some spirits. Edwards and his wife invited them up to their apartment, directly above where the jewels were kept, to recover. Blood and his wife hung out for a bit and then left. In a gesture of supposed gratitude, Blood returned to the Edwardses and gave Mrs. Edwards the gift of 4 pairs of white gloves as a thank you. He had decided that he was going to make his way to the jewels by way of becoming BFFs with Mr. and Mrs. Edwards. It only took him the better part of a month to ingratiate himself with their family, including making up a nephew with a sizable annual income who could be a suitable marriage match for the Edwards' daughter. He convinced Mr. Edwards to show the jewels to himself, his supposed nephew, and 2 other friends, which is when he enacted his plan to steal the royal jewels. Contemporary reports say that Blood and his friends came equipped with canes concealing thin swords and pocket pistols, but given how they executed their plan, I think that's probably a bit of romantic embellishment. One friend stationed himself outside to keep watch, and once the other 3 were inside the chamber with the jewels, they threw a cloak over poor Mr. Edwards, hit him in the head with a mallet, then bound, gagged, and stabbed him in an effort to subdue him. A 77-year-old man in 17th century London. The sequence of events that follow read more like a Three Stooges script than any kind of sophisticated heist. Once Blood and his buddies got to the jewels, they used a mallet to flatten the imperial state crown so that he could fit it in his jacket. The scepter with the cross, that crazy rod that looks like something out of a Magical Girl anime that holds the gigantic Cullinan diamond, was sawed in half in order to transport it. The Sovereign's Orb, that big gold sphere with a cross on it that has to be awkwardly carried in the hand, was stuffed down someone's pants. That thing is pretty large and hefty. I can't imagine that was the most practical choice. They were discovered mid-theft, and I don't know exactly how. There are varying and conflicting reports, but, again, 77-year-old Mr. Edwards, hit in the head with a mallet, bound, gagged, and stabbed, eventually managed to free himself and yell to sound the alarm. Following a completely inept musket shootout on horseback, during which Blood dropped the flattened crown, all 3 pieces were recovered. It was reported that the scepter and orb were returned with some stones missing and some loose, though I don't think that part was intentional theft. I think giant gold gem-encrusted orbs aren't meant to be transported in someone's breeches, and I don't think that the scepter was intended to withstand the trauma of being sawn in half. So, Blood and his associates must have died a slow and agonizing death while being imprisoned in the Tower of London, right? No, not even close. For whatever reason, King Charles I not only pardoned Blood, but gave him a pension of £500 a year and some property in Ireland, where Blood was born. By contrast, Talbot Edwards, who endured head trauma, stabbing, and the indignity of someone pretending to be his friend, all for his job, was awarded a pension of £300 a year, which, apparently, The king never paid out. There are a lot of theories as to why Blood was not punished and was in fact rewarded for his crime, including the theory that he was actually a spy. But my favorite theory is a simple one, and the one I think is most likely to be true. King Charles liked a bold rapscallion. He was apparently quite tickled when Blood told him that the crown jewels were only worth £6,000, not the £100,000 at which the crown had valued them. I mean, yeah, I can see how, after smashing the crown with a mallet and leaving a handful of loose gems in someone's pants, they're probably not as valuable anymore. This incident remains the only time that the British crown jewels have been stolen. So that's one royal scandal, one which ended pretty positively for everyone except poor Mr. Edwards and whoever had to repair these now terribly fucked up pieces. Our next scandal starts in the decade before Thomas Blood had his brilliant idea to have his friends shove royal jewels down their pants, with a striking, large, blue diamond known as the Tavernier Blue. The Tavernier Blue, most likely sourced by the big daddy of fancy gems himself, fanatical gem dealer Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, from the famed Golconda mines of India in 1666, was described as being violet in color and of perfect clarity. It weighed roughly 115 carats, was of a fairly flat cut, and was only slightly finished. Tavernier's original sketch of the gem shows a completely flat table facet cut into the top and bottom, with a few irregularly spaced facets around the edges. The entire thing looks sort of trapezoidal. It seems this version of the diamond was set into a cravat pin in 1674, which seems excessively large, but I can't hate it. Tavernier sold this stone, along with either 25 or 1,000 other gemstones, depending on who you ask, to the Sun King himself, Louis XIV. In 1678, Louis XIV had the stone recut by the court jeweler, Jean Pitou, transforming it into the French blue, at the cost of about 50 carats. The new cut weighed just 68 carats. Apparently, it was worn around the king's neck, suspended from a ribbon. Very cute. The next change to the stone comes about in 1749, when Louis XV has it made into one of the central elements of an elaborate Order of the Golden Fleece pendant. The next dramatic happening in the stone's history is the one where things really start to take a turn. It was stolen, along with many other royal jewels, in 1792, during the chaos of the French Revolution. And, seemingly from there, it disappeared forever. Totally and entirely by coincidence, no relation whatsoever, a fucking huge blue diamond shows up in the records of the Hope banking family in 1839. This chunky but somewhat ugly blue diamond was smaller than the French blue, yes, but it did look suspiciously familiar. As early as 1850, people were trying to figure out if it could possibly be a large chunk of the missing French blue. Not to spoil the ending for everyone, but we do know now that it is unequivocally the largest part of the missing diamond. We also know, just by using our eyes, that the recutting of the stone did not do it any favors. It lacks the fire and brilliance that the French blue is described as having, and the telltale violet color described by Tavernier looks like a silty, sullen gray. Since it was cut just to hide its origins as the famed blue diamond stolen from the French royal jewels, I'd wager it was done by someone who wasn't exactly qualified to be working with material of this caliber. This stone actually shows up a little earlier than its first appearance in the Hope family's records. A blue diamond described as the same cut and weight as the Hope is mentioned as being in the possession of a London diamond merchant in 1812, 20 years after the theft. Conveniently, right after the statute of limitations had run out for the crime. For over a century, there had been record of a leaden model of the French blue existing somewhere. A perfect scale replica of the stone after the first recutting made out of lead. The problem was, no one knew where to find it. The only other references available were imperfect sketches of the Tavernier and French blue. In a stroke of incredible luck, the model turned up in the archives of the Paris National Museum of Natural History in 2007. This, combined with digital CAD modeling, is how we can say that the Hope Diamond is 100% a large chunk of the French blue. The model also shows us that the French blue was cut much better than previously thought, giving us even more to mourn with the blunt awkwardness of the recut Hope Diamond. So we know the Hope Diamond is what's left of the Tavernier Blue, but that's only part of the stone. The Tavernier Blue weighed 115 carats before cutting. The French Blue, when stolen, weighed just over 68 carats. The Hope Diamond weighs just over 45 carats. That leaves a little more than 60 carats unaccounted for, meaning that there has to be at least one other blue diamond left over from all of those recuttings, right? Well, there is a, frankly, in my opinion, quite ugly little stick pin in the Romanov collections of the Russian State Diamond Fund. It holds a 7.6 carat blue diamond that is a very familiar shade of gray violet with a rather choppy and unsophisticated cut. The stone was originally set as a ring for Empress Maria Feodorovna, and the little bit of information I can find dates it to around 1800. This is the best contender for what happened to the largest bit of the remaining material from the French blue being cut down to the Hope Diamond. Two more potential pieces of the stone were the Brunswick blue diamond, a pear-shaped stone weighing 7 or 8 carats, and a much smaller stone of identical blue, the Piri diamond, weighing about a carat. Both of these are lost to history, probably recut again at some point in time if they had the fortune of not going missing, if they even existed, so we will probably never know for sure. If these two stones did exist and were actually from the same stone, they likely came from the pieces cut from the Tavernier blue to shape it into the French blue, before the theft. I think it is worth noting that the GIA, that's the Gemological Institute of America, a much respected institution, believes that there are no sister stones to the Hope Diamond resulting from either recutting. Because I, like King George I, like a bold rapscallion, the last scandal we're going to discuss on this week's episode is the Great Diamond Hoax of 1872. This is the golden era of the Victorian swindle, when a confidence man with a little bit of smarts and gumption could create a very lucrative career for himself. Not long after the start of the California Gold Rush, and right in the middle of the South Africa Diamond Rush, two enterprising grifters from Kentucky had a brilliant idea. The fact that an occasional diamond or two had turned up in California during the gold rush helped set the stage for this elaborate scam. Our story starts with a man named Philip Arnold, born in Kentucky but living and working in San Francisco. He worked as an assistant bookkeeper for the Diamond Drill Company, which made exactly that, drill bits covered in industrial diamond grit. These industrial drill bits were an integral tool in the modernization and industrialization that was happening during the late 1800s. Arnold seemed to have quite an interest in the industrial diamonds that were used to manufacture the bits, and even went so far as to read published scientific works on the subject. At some point, he had amassed a small collection of uncut diamonds, likely pilfered from his employer. He mixed these diamonds with some uncut garnets, rubies, and sapphires, all stones that can be found in North America, which he likely bought from Native Americans in Arizona. With his mixed bag of uncut gems, and a partner, his older cousin John Slack, he set off to make his millions. The pair's first mark was a banker by the name of George D. Roberts. Arnold and Slack showed up at his office late one evening, looking stressed out, bedraggled, and clutching a small leather sack of what they claimed was something very valuable. They said that they would have deposited whatever was in the little sack at the Bank of California if it weren't already so late. They were coy and tight-lipped about what they had in the sack until one of them let it slip that they had rough diamonds. Robert, sensing a shitload of money in this opportunity, teased a source out of them. All they were willing to say was that they found the stones in quote-unquote Indian territory, a sort of half-lie since Arnold had probably bought some of the rough gems from Native Americans. It's unclear whether Arnold and Slack left the bag of gems with Robert or not, but Robert did swear his silence and secrecy. Of course, he immediately broke that promise, telling at least 2 different people about the exciting and incredibly lucrative possibility of American diamonds. Founder of the Bank of California, William C. Ralston, and a man with one of the most delightfully 19th century names I have ever encountered, financier Asbury Harpending. This was exactly what Arnold had hoped for. By swearing Robert to secrecy, he all but guaranteed that the word would get out. Now it was time for phase 2 of the scam. Arnold and Slack threw together an even bigger bag of rough industrial diamonds and uncut gems. They told Robert that they had made a second visit to the mine, pulling out stones worth a total of $600,000. Robert was entirely sold by this point. He roped in 2 more associates, mining entrepreneurs William Lent and General George S. Dodge. The 5 co-conspirators decided that they had to get Arnold and Slack out of the picture fast, so that they could get their hands on the source of the gems themselves. Naturally, this is exactly the way Arnold hoped the plan would go. He and Slack initially resisted payment, but eventually asked for $100,000 for their share, $50,000 now, and $50,000 after they had made a 3rd trip to the mine. Can you tell where this is going? Arnold and Slack took that first $50,000 and made haste to London, where they spent $20,000 on over 1,000 uncut diamonds and other gemstones. Some of these were thrown in a sack as further evidence of how much good shit they were finding, while the rest of them were kept in order to pepper the still secret field where they were supposedly finding these stones. Yes, I keep referring to it as a mine, but apparently it was just an open field with gems waiting to be plucked off the surface. When the pair returned to San Francisco, they offered to make one last trip to the mine to bring back more stones. Of course, this trip was so that they could scatter their bounty of stones around the field in preparation for the next step of the scam. They returned from the excursion, carrying that 3rd sack of uncut jewels they had put together during their trip to London, whatever they hadn't thrown around a field, claiming the stones were worth $1 million. Arnold and Slack were allowing their investors to hang on to this bag of stones as a guarantee of their investment. Harpending recounts how he rushed the bag of gems home and, after throwing a sheet over his billiard table, upended the bag and dumped the contents. He wrote that, quote, "It seemed like a dazzling, many-colored cataract of light." Because Harpending and the rest of the investors were no idiots, they immediately had 10% of the gems appraised by Charles Louis Tiffany himself. He looked the gems over, declared them to be of tremendous value, and then had them sent off to his lapidary in New York, who came back with a valuation of $150,000. Remember, this was just a 10% sampling of the stones that Arnold and Slack had bought in London for $20,000. It turns out that neither Tiffany nor his lapidary, that's someone who cuts and facets gemstones, had much experience with uncut stones. Taking this $150,000 at face value, the investors did a little quick math and decided the most recent sack of jewels must be worth at least $1.5 million. Once Arnold got word of the valuation, he was overjoyed. His little scheme now bore the stamp of authenticity of America's premier jeweler. He managed to extract another $100,000 out of the investors and hurried off to London to spend another $8,000 on uncut stones to throw around his gemstone field. Can you imagine happening across this field by accident before it's revealed to the investors? Just minding your business, traveling somewhere on foot or horseback, and encountering this lone field glittering with hundreds of rough gems? I can't help but visualize it as a tidy square of plowed dirt holding an array of glittering stones. Finally, the investors, along with a mining professional named Henry Janin, boarded a train and headed out to see this secret gem field. After an elaborate, roundabout trek to the field, which was much closer to the train station than Arnold and Slack led on, the group arrived and, of course, immediately began digging up diamonds and other gems. Apparently, a few pearls were pulled up, too, which is so funny. I'd have to think it was a tremendously clever joke, but I think it's clear that it was probably just an oversight. All of the investors were completely fooled and began staking out an area of about 3,000 acres, which they suspected were worth mining. Of course, Arnold and Slack had barely covered a single acre when peppering the land with stones. At this point in the scam, Slack very intelligently decided to fuck off and disappear, while Arnold managed to extract another $150,000 payment out of the investors, along with selling $300,000 in basically imaginary stocks to this mine. He swiftly left town for Kentucky shortly after. So, what eventually exposed the hoax? A pedantic, prideful nerd, of course. A chance encounter with Clarence King, a Yale-educated geologist responsible for surveying and mapping a significant chunk of the American West, which, at the time, was essentially an inhospitable no-man's land. Hearing from these quote-unquote suspicious diamond hunters that they had found a massive source of diamonds, rubies, sapphires, and other gems, King was immediately both suspicious and cautious. If these gems had been found in an area that King had already surveyed, it would call into question the quality of his work and make things pretty difficult with the government. Through guesswork and deduction, he and his team found the site, and with it, dozens of gemstones. They, too, were lured in by the promise of glitter and fortune until the next day, when King noticed something peculiar. Every time a diamond turned up, about a dozen rubies turned up with it. A conveniently consistent pattern that would not have occurred in nature. After doing some literal digging and realizing that there were no stones to be found beyond a few inches below the surface, King and his men rushed back to San Francisco, determined to reveal the fraud to Janin and the investors. From here, all hell broke loose, with the Bank of California having to cancel a planned sale of 100,000 shares of stock in the mine, intended to sell for $100 a share. There was also the publication of a letter penned by Clarence King, attesting to the fact that this land was worthless and that the entire enterprise was a hoax. As far as I can tell, Slack got away with no consequences and a total payment of $100,000. Arnold, the mastermind of this scheme, never saw real legal consequences for his part in it either. He did eventually settle out of court with one of the investors, William Lent, for $150,000, admitting that he may have planted some diamonds, but his total take was $550,000. That's roughly $8 million in today's money. Arnold eventually became a banker himself because nothing made any sense in the 1800s, before dying of pneumonia at the age of 49. That's it for this episode's selection of scandals. From priceless jewels shoved down someone's pants to the graceless chopping up of one of the most sensational blue diamonds the world will likely ever see, these scandals are not exactly lighthearted, but they really only resulted in a loss of money and, yes, probably some bits and pieces of blue diamond. Next episode, we will tackle a much more somber scandal, one that may have cost a woman her life: Marie Antoinette and the affair of the diamond necklace. A scheme that has led to an innocent woman being haunted by a terrible reputation for nearly 2.5 centuries. This month we'll also tackle a few other scandals, like where the hell is the Amber Room? How the theft of Josephine Bonaparte's so-called divorce jewelry led to the creation of the modern police force in Europe. And that's not the scandal. The scandal is insufferable sad boy Napoleon trying to impress the woman he had just divorced in an attempt to salvage his public image. And, of course, how a bunch of surfers managed to steal priceless gems from the Museum of Natural History here in New York City. That about wraps it up. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into some historical jewelry scandals. If you liked this episode, please leave me a rating and review wherever you're listening. If you want to watch my videos, you can find me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube under moonhoney.jewelry. If you want to see my goldsmithing work and the jewelry that I make, you can find it at shopmoonhoney.com. If you want to join me on Patreon and vote on future episodes and deep dive topics, you can head on over to patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. Last but not least, merch for this show can be found at merch.shopmoonhoney.com. As always, thanks for being here, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time for more ancient history jewelry stories.